A civil lawsuit filed against Garth Brooks yesterday in California makes multiple serious allegations against the singer. Allegations that Brooks says he is incapable of. A warning, some of the alleged details are graphic and disturbing.
He sold out stadiums that weren't built for country music. He rewrote the rules of what a country star was allowed to look like, sound like, and do on a stage. And at the very peak of his power, he walked away from all of it. Now, at 64, Garth Brooks is fighting a legal battle that has nothing to do with music, and everything to do with the question of who he really is. This is the story of a man who built one of the biggest careers in the history of American music, and how, piece by piece, the life behind that career turned out to be far more complicated than the legend ever let on. Garth Brooks came from Tulsa, Oklahoma, born into a household where music wasn't a luxury, it was simply part of daily life. His father worked in the oil industry and dabbled in songwriting on the side, and his mother had actually recorded music professionally years earlier. With 6 kids in the house, nobody was singled out as the talented one. Music was just something the family did together, around the living room, around the piano, without any grand plan attached to it. Nobody in that house was predicting a future superstar. They were just a big, loud, musical Oklahoma family. Young Garth wasn't dreaming of stadiums. He was an athlete first, competitive in track and field, and he went on to Oklahoma State University on a javelin scholarship. Music was still just a hobby, something he did in his dorm room and in small local clubs on the side. College is where he started performing more seriously, testing his voice in front of real audiences instead of just family members. He wasn't polished. He wasn't famous. He was a college kid trying to figure out if he had anything worth pursuing beyond his hometown. He actually made a first attempt at Nashville in 1985, and it did not go the way the movies would have you believe. He turned around and drove home within hours of arriving, discouraged by what he found. That failed first trip matters because it shows this wasn't a story of instant validation. He wasn't discovered in a diner and whisked off to stardom. He had to go home, regroup, finish his degree, get married to his college girlfriend, and build up the nerve to try again. The second time he moved to Nashville in 1987, he came with more experience, more maturity, and a clearer sense of what he wanted to say with his music. Nashville in the late 80s was a tough, competitive scene, full of talented singers who never got their name in lights. Garth spent time playing in bars, learning the business side of the industry, and absorbing influences that weren't strictly country at all. He grew up listening to rock acts and arena performers just as much as he listened to classic country songwriters, and that mixture is exactly what made him stand out once labels started paying attention. His debut album arrived in 1989, and while it didn't detonate overnight, it planted the seeds for something much bigger. Songs from that first record connected with everyday listeners in a way that felt personal rather than polished, and radio stations slowly started to notice. Then came the album that changed everything. His follow-up record didn't just sell, it exploded, and it turned Garth Brooks from a promising new artist into a household name almost overnight. What made him different wasn't just the songwriting, it was the way he performed it. He treated a country concert like a full-blown arena spectacle, borrowing the physical energy of rock shows he'd grown up admiring. He ran across stages. He used elaborate lighting and pyrotechnics. He interacted with the crowd like he was trying to pull every single person in the building into the performance with him. Traditionalists in Nashville weren't always thrilled about it. Some critics felt he was diluting the genre, making it too big, too loud, too commercial. But audiences didn't care what the critics thought. They showed up in numbers nobody had seen before for a country artist. By the early 90s, Garth Brooks wasn't competing with other country singers anymore. He was competing with the biggest pop and rock acts on the planet for sales records. He became one of the best-selling solo artists in American music history, with career sales eventually surpassing well over 100 million albums worldwide. He crossed over into audiences that had never given country music a second look before, and in doing so, he forced the entire industry to rethink what commercial success in the genre could actually look like. Stadium tours, elaborate stage production, massive multi-night residencies, all of that became normal for country artists largely because Garth proved there was an audience hungry for it. It's worth pausing on just how unusual that level of crossover success was for a country artist at the time. Before Garth, country music mostly stayed inside its own lane commercially, respected within its genre but rarely competing on the same sales charts as the biggest rock and pop stars of the era. Garth blew through that ceiling. He topped the all-genre album charts. He drew comparisons to some of the biggest touring acts in any format, not just country. Record executives who had spent years thinking of country as a smaller, regional business suddenly had to reconsider what the genre's commercial ceiling actually was. Younger artists coming up behind him watched what he did and adjusted their own ambitions accordingly, aiming for stadiums instead of state fairs, aiming for national crossover appeal instead of staying inside a narrower lane. That shift in ambition across an entire generation of country performers is one of the quieter, less talked about parts of his legacy, but it's arguably just as important as any individual album or tour statistic. He also changed the business side of live music in ways that outlasted the 90s entirely. Garth became known for pushing back against sky-high ticket prices, insisting that shows stay accessible to working-class fans rather than being priced purely for maximum profit. He wanted arenas full of people who had saved up for a night out, not just people who could afford premium seating without thinking twice about it. That philosophy became part of his identity just as much as the music itself, reinforcing the image of a superstar who never forgot the audience that built him. But that level of fame comes with a cost that doesn't show up on a sales chart. Garth had married his college sweetheart, Sandy Mal, back before any of the fame arrived, and for a while she was simply his partner through the grind of touring and trying to make it. As his career expanded into something almost unmanageable, the distance between them grew too. Constant touring schedules, unrelenting public attention, and the sheer scale of what his career had become put enormous strain on a marriage that had started out in a much smaller, quieter version of his life. They had 3 daughters together, and it was really those daughters who became the turning point in his story. Garth has spoken candidly over the years about realizing that his children were growing up largely without him around for the ordinary, unglamorous moments that actually shape a childhood. Not the birthdays that make headlines, but the regular Tuesday afternoons that nobody remembers except the people who were there. Garth has talked over the years about how disorienting that stretch of his life became, trying to reconcile the version of himself that thousands of strangers screamed for every night with a version of himself that was supposed to walk in the door and simply be a husband and a father. Those two roles don't naturally coexist. One demands constant motion, constant performance, constant availability to an audience that never stops wanting more. The other demands stillness, routine, and a kind of consistency that touring simply doesn't allow. For years he tried to split the difference, coming home between legs of a tour, trying to be present in the small windows his schedule allowed. But a marriage built on small windows eventually runs out of room to breathe, and that's ultimately what happened between him and Sandy. In 2000, Garth and Sandy divorced, and the following year, at what many would consider the absolute height of his commercial power, Garth Brooks did something almost unheard of in the music business. He stepped away from the road entirely. He didn't retire quietly and fade into the background while still releasing music behind the scenes. He essentially paused his touring career so he could be a full-time, present father to his 3 girls. He said in interviews that he made a promise to himself that he would be home for his daughters until the youngest one graduated high school, and he largely kept that promise, turning down enormous amounts of money and countless touring opportunities in the process. For an industry built on striking while the iron is hot, walking away at the peak of his popularity was almost unthinkable. But for Garth, the math was simple. You cannot get childhood back once it's gone, no matter how many #1 albums you have. Right around that same period, before he stepped back for his daughters, Garth attempted one of the strangest creative experiments of his career. He created an entirely fictional pop-rock persona named Chris Gaines, complete with a different image, a different sound, and a planned movie project built around the character. The whole thing was meant to be an ambitious crossover experiment, blending his own musical identity with a completely separate artistic alter ego. Audiences and critics alike were confused by it. It didn't land the way he hoped, and it remains one of the more debated chapters of his career, a reminder that even an artist operating at the top of the industry can misjudge how far people are willing to follow him into something unfamiliar. It wasn't a total failure, the music still sold reasonably well, but it never became the multimedia phenomenon he had envisioned, and it quietly faded from the conversation once his focus shifted toward his family. After stepping back from constant touring, Garth didn't disappear from music completely, but he dramatically scaled down his public presence for years, focusing on raising his daughters, doing selective performances, and staying largely out of the spotlight that had defined his 20s and 30s. During this quieter period, his relationship with fellow country star Trisha Yearwood deepened into something more serious. The two had actually known each other since the late 80s, long before either of them became major stars, and their friendship slowly evolved after both of their first marriages ended. Garth proposed to Trisha on stage in front of a live audience in 2005, and they married later that same year in a small, private ceremony rather than a massive celebrity spectacle. Trisha has spoken about deliberately stepping back from her own extensive touring schedule during those years to help build a stable, present home life with Garth and his 3 daughters, something that mattered enormously to both of them after watching how relentless touring had strained relationships in the past. Once his daughters were grown, Garth made the decision to return to large-scale touring, and the comeback was massive. He didn't quietly slip back into the industry, he returned with some of the highest-grossing tours in country music history, breaking his own previous attendance and revenue records. It proved that the audience hadn't forgotten him, and in many ways it proved that stepping away hadn't hurt his legacy at all. It had only added to the mythology of an artist who was willing to sacrifice fame for family and still come back stronger than ever. But even the biggest comeback story in country music wasn't without its stumbles, and one of the most painful public moments came when Garth attempted to bring his touring show to Ireland in 2014. 5 concerts were scheduled at Croke Park in Dublin, and the demand from fans was staggering, with reports suggesting hundreds of thousands of tickets had already been sold before the shows were even confirmed by local authorities. The problem was that Dublin City Council only approved licenses for 3 of the 5 planned shows, citing concerns from residents living near the venue about noise and disruption. Garth made the decision that he would either perform all 5 shows as originally planned, treating every ticket holder equally, or he would cancel the entire run rather than choose which fans got to see him and which fans would be left out. In the end, negotiations completely fell apart, and all 5 shows were cancelled. It was a financial and emotional blow, not just for Garth but for the local economy that had been counting on the revenue from an event of that size. Garth has described that period as one of the most painful moments of his career, comparing the emotional weight of it to losing a family member, which gives you a sense of just how personally invested he was in that tour actually happening the way he had promised his fans it would. 4 years, that Ireland cancellation and the Chris Gaines experiment were probably the 2 biggest controversies most casual fans associated with Garth Brooks. He was largely seen as a beloved, wholesome figure in American music, someone whose biggest scandals were a cancelled tour and an ill-fated alter ego. That image shifted dramatically in the fall of 2024, when Garth Brooks became the subject of a serious legal battle that has continued, in various forms, all the way into this year. In September of 2024, Garth Brooks preemptively filed a lawsuit in Mississippi against a former hairstylist and makeup artist who had worked for him, accusing her of attempted extortion. According to his filing, he claimed she had demanded a significant amount of money after threatening to go public with allegations against him, and he characterized the situation as a shakedown. Just days later, that same woman filed her own lawsuit in California, publicly accusing Garth Brooks of sexual assault, alleging that an incident occurred back in 2019 during a work trip. Garth has denied every part of her allegations, publicly stating that he does not recognize the version of himself being described in her claims and insisting he has done nothing wrong. What followed was not a quick resolution, but a long, tangled legal fight across 2 different states, involving questions about which court should even hear the case, whether the accuser could remain anonymous during the proceedings, and dueling accusations of intimidation from both legal teams. As of now, no court has ruled on the actual merits of the sexual assault allegations themselves. The case remains legally unresolved, tied up in procedural battles about jurisdiction and identity protection rather than a trial addressing what did or did not happen. Garth has continued to deny the allegations throughout, and by all public accounts, he has remained resolute in that denial, while his accuser's legal team has remained equally firm that they intend to see the case through to a verdict. It's important to be clear here. These are allegations that Garth denies. The matter has not been decided by any court, and nothing in this story should be treated as a confirmed fact about what happened between two people behind closed doors. What we do know is that the public fallout has been significant, reshaping how a lot of longtime fans think about an artist they had spent decades trusting. That's really what makes this chapter of his life land so differently than his earlier controversies. A cancelled tour is disappointing. A strange